The first rays of sunlight crept through the heavy curtains of Kensington Palace as London slowly awakened on this extraordinary morning. Prince William opened his eyes earlier than usual, his mind immediately racing with thoughts of the day ahead. The silence in his bedroom was broken only by the distant sounds of activity already beginning in the palace corridors below. He lay still for a moment, staring at the ornate ceiling above him, trying to calm the nervous energy building in his chest. In the adjoining room, Catherine was already awake, sitting quietly by the large window overlooking the palace gardens. She had been up for nearly an hour, unable to sleep with the excitement and anticipation coursing through her veins. The morning light caught the delicate features of her face as she sipped her tea, her thoughts wandering to the significance of what lay ahead. This was not just another royal engagement or formal ceremony. Today would mark a historic moment that would be remembered and talked about for generations to come. Down the hallway, the children were experiencing the morning in their own unique ways. Prince George, the eldest at 10 years old, had woken up with 100 questions buzzing in his mind. He understood more than his younger siblings about the importance of royal duties, but today felt different. He had heard the staff whispering with unusual excitement, and the palace seemed to hum with an energy he had never felt before. George pressed his face against his bedroom window, amazed to see crowds of people already gathering outside the palace gates, even though it was barely 7 in the morning. Princess Charlotte, 8 years old and full of spirit, was in her element. She had been looking forward to wearing her special dress for weeks. The cream-colored gown with tiny embroidered flowers hung carefully in her wardrobe, and she kept glancing at it every few minutes. Charlotte understood that today was special because everyone kept telling her so, but she was more excited about the dress and the attention than the ceremony itself. She danced around her room in her nightgown, practicing her curtsy and imagining how pretty she would look in all the photographs. Little Prince Louis, at 5 years old, was the most oblivious to the gravity of the day. He woke up as he always did, immediately reaching for his favorite toy cars scattered beside his bed. Louis had been told they were going somewhere important today, but to him, every place they went as a family seemed important because there were always lots of people and cameras. He was more interested in whether they would have cake afterward and if he could bring his blue racing car along for the journey. The palace staff had been working since before dawn, ensuring every detail was perfect. Chef had prepared a light breakfast for the family, knowing that nerves might affect their appetites. The florists had delivered fresh arrangements for the main rooms, filling the air with the scent of white roses and peonies. Security teams had completed their final checks, and drivers had polished the royal vehicles until they gleamed like mirrors in the morning sun. Outside the palace walls, London was transforming. The normally busy streets around Kensington Palace had been closed to regular traffic since midnight. Barriers lined the roads, and police officers stood at regular intervals, their presence both protective and welcoming. The early morning joggers and dog walkers had been replaced by families carrying folding chairs, thermos flasks, and British flags. Some had traveled from Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, making this a true celebration for the entire kingdom. William finally rose from his bed and walked to his window. The sight that greeted him was both thrilling and daunting. Hundreds of people were already gathered, and it was not even 8 o'clock. He could see news vans setting up their equipment, photographers testing their cameras, and tourists taking selfies with the palace in the background. The weight of tradition and expectation settled on his shoulders, but it was a weight he had been preparing to carry his entire life. Catherine joined him at the window, slipping her hand into his. Together, they watched their future subjects gathering in peaceful celebration. The morning mist was lifting, revealing what promised to be a beautiful, clear day. The weather forecast had predicted sunshine, a good omen for what was already shaping up to be a perfect day for this historic event. As the clock struck 8, they knew it was time to begin their preparations. The next few hours would be filled with careful grooming, final fittings, and detailed briefings from their staff. But for now, in these quiet moments before the day truly began, they stood together as a family, ready to step into history at Westminster Abbey. The morning routine at Kensington Palace had begun in earnest as the clock struck 9. Catherine's personal stylist, Sarah, had arrived with her team of assistants, their arms filled with makeup cases, hairstyling tools, and delicate accessories that sparkled in the morning light. The dressing room had been transformed into a professional salon, with mirrors surrounded by bright bulbs, and every surface covered with brushes, powders, and jewelry boxes. Catherine sat patiently in the center of it all, her hair being carefully sectioned and pinned by expert hands. She had chosen a sophisticated updo that would complement the stunning sapphire tiara she would wear later. The tiara, which had belonged to Queen Elizabeth, sat waiting on a velvet cushion nearby, its precious stones catching the light every time someone moved past it. Sarah worked with gentle precision, knowing that every strand of hair had to be perfect for the hundreds of cameras that would capture every angle. Meanwhile, in his dressing room across the hall, William was being helped into his ceremonial military uniform by his valet, James. The dark blue fabric was heavy with gold braiding and medals that told the story of his service and heritage. Each button was polished to perfection, and every crease had been pressed with military precision. William stood still as James adjusted the ceremonial sword at his side, the same sword that had been worn by his father and grandfather before him. The weight of it reminded him of the generations of tradition he was carrying forward. The children were having their own preparations in the family's private quarters. George stood on a small platform while the tailor made final adjustments to his miniature suit. The young prince tried to stand as straight as his father, practicing the serious expression he thought he should wear for such an important day. His navy blue suit was a perfect smaller version of his father's formal wear, complete with a tiny pocket watch chain that made him feel very grown-up indeed. Charlotte was having the most fun of all. Her dressing room had been filled with flowers and sparkly decorations, making it feel like a princess's chamber from a fairy tale. Her dress hung like a cloud of cream silk and delicate lace, with hundreds of tiny seed pearls sewn along the bodice. The palace seamstresses had worked for weeks on the intricate embroidery that decorated the skirt, creating patterns of roses and thistles that represented the union of England and Scotland. As Charlotte's hair was being styled into soft curls with a delicate headband of pearls and flowers, she chattered excitedly about everything she could see. She wanted to know why her dress was so much fancier than her school dresses, why everyone was taking so many pictures, and whether she would meet the Queen's horses later. Her stylist answered each question with patience and kindness, understanding that this level of attention was both exciting and overwhelming for a young girl. Little Louis presented the biggest challenge for the palace staff. At 5 years old, he had no interest in standing still while people fussed over his clothes. His outfit was simpler than his siblings, but equally important. Navy blue shorts, a white shirt with puffy sleeves, and a small military-style jacket that made him look like a miniature soldier. Louis kept trying to escape to play with his toys, and it took the combined efforts of his nanny and 2 assistants to keep him in one place long enough to get dressed. The breakfast room had been set with the family's finest china, though most of the food remained untouched. Nerves had affected everyone's appetite, and the staff understood that this was normal on such important days. Fresh orange juice, perfectly presented fruit, and delicate pastries waited on silver platters, but only Louis showed any real interest in eating, more concerned with the strawberries on his plate than the historic significance of the morning. Catherine's jewelry had been brought from the Tower of London under heavy security. Each piece had its own story and significance. She chose earrings that had belonged to Princess Diana, knowing that William would appreciate having his mother represented in some way on this important day. The sapphires matched her engagement ring perfectly, creating a beautiful harmony of blue that would complement her outfit. As the final touches were applied, and the last photographs were taken of the family in their private quarters, everyone could feel the excitement building. Outside, the crowds continued to grow, their voices creating a distant hum of anticipation that drifted through the palace windows. The heavy wooden doors of Kensington Palace opened with a soft creak as the royal family prepared to make their first public appearance of the day. William stepped out first, his polished black shoes clicking against the stone steps. The morning sun reflected off the gold braiding on his uniform, making him look every inch the future king. He paused for a moment at the top of the steps, taking a deep breath as he surveyed the scene before him. The sight was truly remarkable. Beyond the palace gates, thousands of people lined the streets as far as the eye could see. Men, women, and children of all ages stood behind the barriers, many wearing red, white, and blue clothing to show their support. Some had painted their faces with the British flag, while others held homemade signs with messages of love and congratulations. The atmosphere was electric with excitement and joy. Catherine appeared beside him, her elegant figure graceful in the morning light. Her dress was a masterpiece of royal fashion, flowing behind her like liquid silk. The sapphires in her tiara caught the sunlight and sent tiny rainbows dancing across her face. She smiled warmly at the crowd, her natural charm evident even from a distance. Her hand found William's arm, and together they presented a picture of unity and purpose. George emerged next, trying his best to walk as formally as his parents. His small suit made him look remarkably mature for his age, though his youthful face still carried traces of boyish excitement. He had been practicing his royal wave all morning, and now he lifted his hand tentatively, delighting the crowd when they cheered in response. Charlotte followed, her cream-colored dress making her look like a little angel. She was less concerned with formality than her older brother and waved enthusiastically at everyone she could see. Louis brought up the rear, holding tightly to his mother's other hand. His navy outfit was already slightly rumpled from his attempts to run ahead, and his hair needed smoothing from where he had tried to peek around the adults in front of him. Despite the formal occasion, he remained completely himself, pointing at interesting things in the crowd and whispering questions to his mother that made her smile. The royal protection officers had formed a discreet circle around the family, their trained eyes constantly scanning the crowd and surroundings. Despite the celebratory atmosphere, their job was to ensure the safety of the royal family at all times. They moved with professional precision, invisible to most observers, but always ready to act if needed. The waiting cars gleamed in the morning sunshine. 3 black vehicles sat in perfect formation, each one polished to mirror brightness. The lead car, which would carry William and Catherine, bore small royal flags that fluttered gently in the morning breeze. The drivers, dressed in formal livery, stood at attention beside their vehicles, ready to begin the historic journey through London's streets. Palace staff members lined the courtyard, many of them fighting back tears of emotion. These were people who had worked behind the scenes for months to make this day perfect. They had polished every surface, pressed every garment, and rehearsed every detail. Now they stood as proud witnesses to the fruits of their labor, watching the family they served with such dedication prepare to make history. As the family approached the cars, the sound from beyond the gates grew louder. It was not just cheering now, but singing. Someone in the crowd had started singing the national anthem, and hundreds of voices had joined in. The melody drifted across the palace grounds, creating a spine-tingling moment that reminded everyone present of the significance of the day. Catherine bent down to adjust Charlotte's dress one final time, making sure every fold fell perfectly. William straightened Louis's little jacket and whispered something in his ear that made the young prince giggle. George stood tall and proud, ready to represent his family with dignity, despite his young age. The chief of staff approached William with a final clipboard of details, but the prince waved him away gently. There was nothing more to be done. Every preparation had been made. Every detail had been checked and double-checked. Now it was time to trust in the months of planning and step into the cars that would carry them into the pages of history. As they moved toward the vehicles, photographers captured every step. These images would be printed in newspapers around the world within hours. But for now, they belonged to this perfect moment outside Kensington Palace on a beautiful morning in May. The royal convoy pulled away from Kensington Palace with the smoothness of a well-rehearsed performance. William and Catherine sat in the back seat of the lead car, their hands clasped together as they watched London transform before their eyes. The streets that were usually filled with busy traffic and rushing pedestrians had become something magical. Every sidewalk, every corner, every available space was packed with people who had come to be part of this historic day. Charlotte pressed her small nose against the window, her breath creating tiny clouds on the glass as she tried to see everything at once. The crowd seemed endless to her young eyes. There were families with grandparents in wheelchairs, teenagers with painted faces, and little children sitting on their father's shoulders to get a better view. Everyone was smiling and waving, and Charlotte felt like she was in the middle of the most wonderful parade in the world. George sat beside his sister, trying to maintain the composure he thought was expected of him. But his excitement was impossible to hide completely. His eyes darted from one side of the street to the other, taking in details he would remember for the rest of his life. He saw a group of school children from his own age, holding a banner that read "Good Luck, Prince George," in colorful letters. When he spotted it, he couldn't help but smile and give them a special wave that made them jump up and down with joy. In the second car, Louis was having his own adventure. The 5-year-old had forgotten all about sitting properly and was moving from window to window, pointing at everything that caught his attention. His protection officer and nanny exchanged amused glances as they tried to keep him safely seated while still allowing him to enjoy the experience. Louis spotted a man dressed as a giant British flag and burst into giggles, tugging on his nanny's sleeve to make sure she saw it too. The route through London had been carefully planned to take them past some of the city's most famous landmarks. As they approached Hyde Park Corner, Catherine pointed out Wellington Arch to the children, telling them stories about the history they were passing through. The trees in the park were full of people who had climbed them for a better view, creating an unusual sight that would be talked about for years to come. Police officers lined every intersection, but their presence felt protective rather than threatening. Many of them were smiling and waving too, caught up in the celebratory atmosphere that had overtaken the entire city. Mounted police officers on beautiful horses rode alongside the convoy, their uniforms spotless and their horses stepping proudly as if they knew they were part of something special. The crowds were not just British citizens. Tourists from around the world had planned their trips specifically to witness this moment. American families held small Union Jack flags they had bought from street vendors. Japanese tourists took countless photographs, and Australian backpackers cheered enthusiastically. The diversity of the crowd reflected how this royal event had captured imaginations across the globe. Street vendors had set up stalls selling commemorative items, though business had stopped as everyone focused on watching the convoy pass. Union Jack mugs, royal family photographs, and miniature flags lay forgotten on tables as vendors and customers alike became spectators to history in the making. Even the pigeons seemed to sense the importance of the day, perching quietly on buildings instead of their usual frantic searching for food. As they passed Buckingham Palace, William felt a surge of emotion. The building where he had grown up looked magnificent in the morning sun, its flags flying proudly in the gentle breeze. He thought about his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, who had made this same journey many times throughout her long reign. Today he was continuing that tradition, carrying it forward for his own children and future generations. Catherine noticed a young girl in the crowd who looked about Charlotte's age. The little girl was wearing a homemade tiara made of cardboard and glitter, and when she saw Catherine, she curtsied perfectly. Catherine touched William's arm and nodded toward the child, both of them smiling at the sweet gesture. The journey continued at a stately pace, allowing everyone time to see and be seen. Inside the cars, the royal family experienced a mixture of nervousness and excitement. Outside, London had become a living celebration. Every street transformed into a stage for one of the most memorable days in recent royal history. The royal convoy turned the final corner, and Westminster Abbey came into view like a vision from a fairy tale. The ancient building rose majestically against the blue London sky, its Gothic towers and intricate stone carvings telling stories of nearly 1,000 years of history. Charlotte gasped when she saw it, her small hand reaching for her mother's arm. Even though she had visited the Abbey before, today it looked completely different, more grand and magical than she had ever imagined possible. George straightened in his seat, suddenly understanding the true importance of where they were going. He had learned about Westminster Abbey in his history lessons, but seeing it now, surrounded by thousands of people and dozens of news cameras, made him realize that he was about to become part of that same history. His heart beat faster as he tried to remember all the advice his parents had given him about how to behave. The area around the Abbey had been transformed into something that looked like a royal film set. Red carpets stretched from the street to the main entrance, held in place by golden ropes that gleamed in the sunlight. Massive flower arrangements decorated every pillar and archway, creating a garden of white roses, peonies, and delicate green ferns. The sweet scent of the flowers mixed with the crisp London air, creating an atmosphere that felt both sacred and celebratory. Security was everywhere, but hidden so well that it almost seemed invisible. Plainclothes officers mingled with the crowd, their trained eyes watching everything while trying to blend in with the excited spectators. Snipers were positioned on nearby rooftops, though few people knew to look for them. The Metropolitan Police had planned this operation for months, ensuring that every possible threat had been considered and prepared for. As the first car stopped directly in front of the Abbey's main entrance, a cheer rose from the crowd that was so loud it seemed to shake the ancient stones of the building itself. Photographers rushed forward, their cameras clicking rapidly as they tried to capture the perfect shot. Television crews from around the world pointed their lenses toward the car, broadcasting this moment live to millions of viewers in dozens of countries. William stepped out first, his military uniform impressive against the backdrop of the Abbey's stone facade. He turned to help Catherine from the car, offering his hand with the gallant gesture of a true gentleman. As she emerged, her dress caught the light beautifully, the fabric flowing behind her like liquid gold. The sapphires in her tiara sparkled so brightly that they seemed to create their own tiny light show. Charlotte bounced out of the car with barely contained excitement, her cream-colored dress floating around her like a cloud. She looked around with wide eyes, taking in the massive crowds, the towering building, and the sea of camera flashes that created a constant twinkling light. For a moment, she forgot about walking properly and just stared in wonder at everything around her. George followed more carefully, remembering to stand tall and keep his shoulders back as his father had taught him. He was amazed by how much bigger everything looked when you were standing outside the car instead of peering through windows. The Abbey seemed to stretch endlessly upward, and the crowds extended as far as he could see in every direction. Lewis needed help getting out of the second car, his short legs requiring assistance to reach the ground gracefully. Once his feet touched the red carpet, he looked around with the fearless curiosity that only 5-year-olds possess. The noise didn't frighten him, and the cameras didn't make him shy. Instead, he pointed at the stone gargoyles carved into the Abbey's walls and whispered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear that they looked like funny dragons. The Archbishop of Canterbury appeared at the entrance to the Abbey, his ceremonial robes magnificent in the morning light. He smiled warmly at the family, understanding how overwhelming this moment must be, especially for the children. Behind him, other high-ranking church officials waited in a line, each one honored to be part of this historic day. Catherine bent down to straighten Charlotte's dress one last time and whispered something encouraging in George's ear. William placed a reassuring hand on Lewis's shoulder, making sure his youngest son felt secure in the midst of all the excitement and attention. Together, the family of 5 stood at the threshold of Westminster Abbey, ready to walk through doors that had welcomed kings and queens for centuries. The moment felt suspended in time, as if the entire world was holding its breath before they took their first steps toward making history together as a family. The heavy oak doors of Westminster Abbey opened slowly, revealing the breathtaking interior that had witnessed royal ceremonies for nearly 1,000 years. As the family stepped across the threshold, the temperature dropped noticeably, providing a cool relief from the warm May sunshine outside. The sudden quiet was almost shocking after the cheers and noise of the crowds, replaced by the soft echo of their footsteps on the ancient stone floor. Charlotte's eyes grew wide as she looked up at the soaring ceiling that seemed to reach toward heaven itself. The Gothic arches stretched high above them, decorated with intricate stone carvings that had been crafted by skilled masons centuries ago. Stained glass windows lined the walls, each one telling colorful stories from the Bible and British history. The morning light filtered through the colored glass, casting rainbows of blue, red, and gold across the abbey's interior. George walked carefully beside his parents, his young mind trying to process the incredible beauty and history surrounding him. He had studied pictures of Westminster Abbey in his lessons, but nothing had prepared him for the real experience. Every surface seemed to hold secrets and stories from the past. Stone effigies of long-dead kings and queens lay in eternal rest along the walls, their faces carved with such skill that they seemed almost alive. The abbey was filled with hundreds of distinguished guests, all dressed in their finest formal wear. Ladies wore elegant gowns in soft colors, their jewelry sparkling in the candlelight. Gentlemen stood in perfectly tailored morning coats and top hats, looking like characters from a period drama. Everyone rose to their feet as the royal family entered, creating a gentle rustling sound as silk dresses and formal jackets moved in unison. Louis held tightly to his mother's hand, his small fingers gripping hers as he took in the overwhelming grandeur around him. The little boy had never seen so many people dressed so fancy, and he whispered questions about why everyone was standing up and whether they were all very important people. Catherine smiled and whispered back simple answers, helping him feel comfortable in this grand setting. Hundreds of candles had been lit throughout the abbey, their warm flames creating a golden glow that made the ancient building feel alive and welcoming. The candles stood in tall brass holders that had been polished until they gleamed like mirrors. The soft light danced off the gold decorations on the altar and reflected in the precious stones of the ceremonial vessels arranged for the service. The choir stalls were filled with singers in pristine white robes, their music stands holding specially chosen hymns and anthems for this historic day. The organist sat ready at the magnificent organ, its thousands of pipes rising like a forest of silver trees behind the altar. When the first notes of music began, the sound filled every corner of the abbey with such power and beauty that several guests were moved to tears. William felt the weight of history as he walked down the same aisle where his ancestors had processed for generations. Every step connected him to the past, while carrying him toward the future. His military uniform felt heavier now, not from its physical weight, but from the responsibility it represented. He thought of his father, his grandfather, and all those who had walked this path before him. Catherine gracefully navigated the long train of her dress, while managing to keep Charlotte close and Louis calm. Her experience in royal events showed as she smiled serenely at the guests while keeping one eye on her children. The sapphires in her tiara caught the candlelight beautifully, creating tiny sparkles that seemed to dance as she moved. The procession moved slowly and deliberately toward the altar, each step carefully measured and practiced. Behind them, the guests settled back into their seats with quiet murmurs of admiration and excitement. The archbishop waited with patient dignity, his ceremonial vestments rich with gold thread and precious stones that had been blessed for this special occasion. As they reached their designated places near the altar, the family stood together in the heart of one of England's most sacred spaces. The silence that followed was filled with anticipation, reverence, and the profound sense that they were all witnessing something that would be remembered and talked about for generations to come. The ceremony began with the most beautiful music that had ever filled Westminster Abbey. The choir's voices rose together in perfect harmony, creating sounds so pure and heavenly that they seemed to lift everyone's spirits toward the Gothic ceiling above. The children sat quietly in their designated chairs, their small hands folded in their laps as they had been taught, though their eyes wandered constantly around the magnificent space surrounding them. Charlotte found herself mesmerized by the way the colored light from the stained glass windows painted patterns on the stone floor. She watched as the patterns shifted slightly when clouds passed over the sun outside, creating a gentle dance of colors that kept her entertained during the longer parts of the service. Her little feet swung back and forth under her chair, but she remembered to keep her voice quiet, even when she wanted to point out interesting things to George. George listened carefully to every word spoken by the Archbishop, trying to understand the important meanings behind the formal language. He recognized some phrases from his Sunday school lessons and felt proud when he could follow along with parts of the ceremony. Sometimes he glanced at his father and tried to copy his serious expression, wanting to show everyone that he understood the importance of what was happening. Louis proved to be the most challenging of the three children to keep still during the long ceremony. His 5-year-old attention span was no match for the formal proceedings, no matter how historically significant they were. Catherine kept one hand resting gently on his shoulder, ready to guide him if he became too restless. She had brought a small toy in her purse, but she hoped she wouldn't need to use it in such a sacred setting. William stood throughout the ceremony with perfect posture, his military training evident in every line of his body. He felt the eyes of hundreds of people watching his every move, but more importantly, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This ceremony was more than just tradition. It was a sacred commitment to serve his country and its people for the rest of his life. The Archbishop's voice echoed clearly through the abbey as he spoke the ancient words that had been repeated in this same space for hundreds of years. His ceremonial robes rustled softly as he moved, the gold thread embroidery catching the candlelight and creating tiny sparkles that fascinated the children. The ceremony had been planned down to the smallest detail, but it still felt fresh and meaningful as if it were happening for the very first time. Catherine felt deeply moved by the solemnity and beauty of the moment. She thought about the long journey that had brought her family to this point, from her first meeting with William at university to this incredible day when they stood together at the heart of British tradition. Her dress felt like it was made of clouds and starlight, and she had never felt more beautiful or more proud. The organ music swelled to fill every corner of the abbey, its powerful sound making the ancient stones seem to vibrate with emotion. Guests wiped away tears as they were swept up in the majesty of the moment. Even the most experienced royal watchers admitted they had never witnessed a ceremony quite so moving and perfectly executed as this one. During one particularly quiet part of the service, Charlotte's stomach rumbled audibly, causing several nearby guests to smile sympathetically. She looked mortified and whispered an apology to her mother, who simply squeezed her hand reassuringly. These small human moments reminded everyone present that despite all the pageantry and formality, this was still a family sharing an important milestone together. The Dean of Westminster read from ancient texts, his voice carrying easily through the abbey without amplification. The words spoke of duty, service, and dedication to the people of the realm. George found himself imagining what it would be like to have such responsibilities when he grew up, wondering if he would be brave enough and wise enough to follow in his father's footsteps. As the ceremony progressed, the light outside began to change slightly, indicating that the morning was moving toward afternoon. The sunbeams streaming through the stained glass windows shifted position, creating new patterns of color on the walls and floor. This natural progression of light added another layer of beauty to an already stunning setting. Near the end of this portion of the ceremony, Louis finally gave in to sleepiness and rested his head against his mother's arm. Catherine adjusted her position slightly to make him more comfortable while maintaining her own perfect posture. The warm weight of her sleeping child against her side made this grand formal occasion feel more personal and precious. The final notes of the hymn faded away, leaving a profound silence that seemed to hold all the hopes and prayers of everyone present. In that moment, Westminster Abbey felt less like an ancient building and more like a living witness to the continuing story of the British royal family. Just as the ceremony reached its most solemn moment, something wonderful and unexpected happened that would be remembered and talked about for years to come. Little Louis, who had been dozing peacefully against his mother's side, suddenly woke up and noticed a beam of colored light from the stained glass window dancing across the floor near his feet. Without thinking about where he was or how many people were watching, he pointed directly at the colorful spot and said in his clear 5-year-old voice, "Look, Mummy, rainbows on the floor." The comment was not meant to be heard by anyone except his mother, but in the perfect acoustics of Westminster Abbey, his sweet voice carried much further than he intended. A gentle wave of quiet laughter rippled through the assembled guests, starting with those closest to the royal family and spreading outward like circles on a pond. Even the Archbishop paused in his reading and smiled warmly at the innocent observation. Catherine's cheeks turned slightly pink as she whispered to Louis to use his quiet voice, but her embarrassment quickly melted into pride at her son's natural wonder and joy. William glanced down at his youngest child with such obvious love and amusement that several photographers captured the moment for posterity. It was exactly the kind of genuine family moment that reminded everyone that behind all the ceremony and tradition, these were real people who loved each other. Charlotte, seeing that Louis had spoken out loud during the quiet part, leaned over to him and whispered importantly, "You have to whisper in church, Louis." Her matter-of-fact correction made several nearby guests smile even wider. George tried to maintain his serious expression, but couldn't quite hide the grin that tugged at the corners of his mouth when his little brother looked confused about what he had done wrong. The Archbishop, who had children and grandchildren of his own, handled the interruption with perfect grace. He continued with the ceremony as if nothing had happened, but those who knew him well could see the hint of a smile playing around his eyes. Later, people would say that Louis's innocent comment had made the ceremony feel more human and approachable, breaking through some of the formal atmosphere with childlike wonder. An elderly duchess in the third row was heard to whisper to her companion, "How refreshing to see children being children, even in Westminster Abbey." Her sentiment was shared by many of the guests, who had been charmed by the authentic moment in the midst of such formal proceedings. Royal correspondents would later write that this spontaneous comment became one of the most beloved moments of the entire day. Charlotte, inspired by her brother's boldness, began to notice more interesting details around her. She spotted a carved stone bird high up on one of the pillars and wanted to point it out to everyone, but she remembered her mother's lessons about appropriate behavior and kept the discovery to herself. Instead, she filed it away in her memory to share with Louis later when they were back home. George found himself relaxing slightly after his brother's outburst. If Louis could be himself, perhaps George didn't need to be quite so worried about being perfectly proper every single second. He allowed himself to really look around the Abbey and appreciate its beauty, rather than just trying to remember all the rules he had been taught about formal occasions. The organ music resumed, and the choir began another hymn, their voices soaring through the ancient building with renewed warmth and joy. Something about Louis's innocent comment had lifted everyone's spirits and reminded them that this ceremony was not just about duty and tradition, but also about family, love, and the simple pleasure of being together in a beautiful place. Catherine adjusted Louis on her lap so he could see better, and he settled back down contentedly, apparently unaware that he had provided one of the most talked-about moments of the entire event. His comment about the rainbows on the floor would be quoted in newspapers around the world and would become part of the family's cherished memories of this special day. William felt his heart swell with love for his family as he watched his children being themselves despite the grandeur surrounding them. These were the moments that mattered most to him, when the human side of royal life showed through the ceremonial aspects. He realized that his children were teaching him something important about staying genuine and finding joy in small wonders, even in the most formal circumstances. As the ceremony continued, the atmosphere felt warmer and more personal. Louis's spontaneous observation had reminded everyone present that at its heart, this was a celebration of family, continuity, and the simple human connections that make life meaningful. The ancient building seemed to approve, its stones holding not just the weight of history, but the lightness of a child's laughter. As the final prayers were spoken and the last notes of the closing hymn faded into the high vaulted ceiling of Westminster Abbey, the ceremony drew to its magnificent conclusion. The Archbishop gave his final blessing, his words carrying the hopes and good wishes of the entire nation. William and Catherine stood together with their children, their faces glowing with a mixture of relief, joy, and profound satisfaction that everything had proceeded so perfectly. The moment had finally arrived for the royal family to make their way back down the aisle, but this time everything felt different. They were no longer walking toward an unknown future. They had just completed a sacred ceremony that would bind them to their country and its people for the rest of their lives. Their steps were more confident now, filled with purpose and pride in what they had just accomplished together. Charlotte practically skipped beside her parents, her earlier nervousness completely replaced by excitement and happiness. The cream-colored dress that had seemed so important that morning now felt like a natural part of her, flowing around her as she moved with newfound confidence. She waved at the guests with genuine enthusiasm, no longer worried about being perfectly proper every single moment. George walked tall beside his sister, his bearing showing remarkable maturity for someone so young. The morning's events had changed something in him, given him a deeper understanding of what it meant to be part of the royal family. He nodded politely to the guests, but his eyes were bright with excitement and pride. The serious little boy who had entered the abbey had grown up just a little bit during the ceremony. Louis, now fully awake and energized, bounced along between his parents with infectious joy. His earlier comment about the rainbows had made him something of a celebrity among the guests, many of whom smiled particularly warmly when they saw him. He waved enthusiastically at everyone, completely unaware that his spontaneous observation would be quoted in history books for generations to come. As they processed back down the aisle, William felt a tremendous sense of accomplishment and gratitude. The weight of responsibility he had felt that morning had transformed into something more positive, a sense of purpose and determination to serve his country well. Every step took him closer to the doors and the celebration that waited outside, but also toward the future and all the challenges and joys it would bring. Catherine moved with graceful elegance, her dress trailing behind her like a river of silk and starlight. The sapphires in her tiara caught the light from the stained glass windows one last time, creating a final moment of magical sparkle before they reached the doors. She felt deeply moved by everything that had happened and proud beyond words of how well her children had behaved during such a long and formal ceremony. The guests remained standing as the family passed, many of them wiping away tears of emotion. The ceremony had been more beautiful and moving than anyone had expected, and Louis's innocent comment had added a touch of humanity that made it feel personal and real rather than just another formal royal event. Several elderly guests whispered to each other about how lovely it was to see such a close and happy family.